It was 165 AD during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, and the Romans had a problem. First, and most obviously, there was a terrible plague. Some medical historians suspect it was the first appearance of smallpox in the West, but whatever the actual disease, it was lethal. During the 15-year duration of the epidemic, from a quarter to a third of the empire's population died from it, including Marcus Aurelius himself in 180 in Vienna. But the terrible plague exposed an even deeper problem, a religious problem. Roman paganism was not equipped to deal with this, both in terms of belief and action. Rodney Stark, whose book I'm drawing from for this talk, I'm not going to tell you when I'm quoting him because I'm quoting him a lot, writes, "Frequently in human history, crises produced by natural or social disasters have been translated into crises of faith. Typically, this occurs because the disaster places demands upon the prevailing religion that it appears unable to meet. This inability can occur at two levels. First, the religion may fail to provide a satisfactory explanation of why the disaster occurred. Second, the religion may seem to be unavailing against the disaster, which becomes truly critical when all non-religious means also prove inadequate, when the supernatural remains the only plausible source of help. Religions frequently are discarded and new ones accepted in troubled times." Roman paganism had no metaphysical explanation for the plague, and it did not mobilize effective action. So let us imagine ourselves in the places of a Roman city, say, faced with one of these terrible epidemics. Here we are in a city stinking of death. All around us, our family and friends are dropping. We can never be sure if or when we will fall sick too. In the midst of such appalling circumstances, humans are driven to ask, why? So we really should turn them off on the airplane. I thought they made that up. Okay. Humans are driven to ask why. Why is this happening? Why them and not me? Will we all die? Why does the world exist anyway? What is going to happen next? What can we do? If we are pagans, we probably already know that our priests profess ignorance. They do not know why the gods have sent such misery, or if in fact the gods are involved or even care. Worse yet, many of our priests have fled the city, as have the highest civil authorities and the wealthiest families, which adds to the disorder and suffering. Like the pagan religions, Greek philosophy provided no comfort. Cicero had written that it depends on fortune, or as we should say, conditions, whether we are to experience prosperity or adversity. Certain events are indeed due to natural causes beyond human control. This is not a very comforting response. To say that survival is a matter of luck makes the life of the individual seem rather trivial. People will prefer explanations which assert that such events reflect underlying historical intentions, that the larger contours of life are coherent and explicable. Not only were the philosophers of the time unable to provide such meanings, but from the point of view of classical science and philosophy, these events were indeed beyond human control, for no useful medical courses of action could be suggested. So, given all that, what did the pagans actually do in response to the plague? They fled. About a later plague, to give us an idea how these things went, the Christian Dionysius wrote, "At the first onset of the disease, the heathens pushed the sufferers away and fled from their dearest, throwing them into the roads before they were dead, and treated unburied corpses as dirt, hoping thereby to avert the spread and contagion of the fatal disease, but do what they might, they found it difficult to escape." We can learn more about the pagan responses to plagues from the careful account by Thucydides in his History of the Peloponnesian War, of a deadly plague that struck Athens in 431 BC. He wrote, "The doctors were quite incapable of treating the disease because of their ignorance of the right methods. Equally useless were prayers made in the temples, consultation of the oracles, and so forth. Indeed, in the end, people were so overcome by their sufferings that they paid no further attention to such things. Once the contagious nature of the disease was recognized, people were afraid to visit one another. As a result, they died with no one to look after them. Indeed, there were many houses in which all the inhabitants perished through lack of any attention. The bodies of the dying were heaped one on top of the other, and half-dead creatures could be seen staggering about in the streets or flocking around the fountains in their desire for water. The temples in which they took up their quarters were full of the dead bodies of people who had died inside them, for the catastrophe was so overwhelming that men, not knowing what would happen next to them, became indifferent to every rule of religion or law. No fear of God or law of man had a restraining influence. As for the gods, it seemed to be the same thing whether one worshipped them or not, when one saw the good and the bad dying indiscriminately. Thucydides accepted that it was only sensible to flee epidemics and to shun contact with the sick. Now, I know it must be very implausible to imagine a society where people would take an every man for himself attitude in the face of an epidemic, that people might just say lock down in their homes rather than help each other, but I hope you can use your historical imagination to envision the situation. So this brings us to the third problem the Romans had when facing this plague. There was the devastation of the plague itself, the inadequacy of Roman paganism to provide explanation or action in response to the plague, useful action, and finally, there was a rival group that did provide explanation and effective action: the Christians. First, the Christian faith did claim to have answers. The teaching of their faith made life meaningful even amid sudden and surprising death. Even a shattered remnant of survivors who had somehow made it through war or pestilence, or both, could find warm, immediate, and healing consolation in the vision of a heavenly existence for those missing relatives and friends. Christianity was therefore a system of thought and feeling thoroughly adapted to a time of troubles in which hardship, disease, and violent death commonly prevailed. The Christians also acted differently. Again, from Dionysius, drawing from a later plague, most of our brother Christians showed unbounded love and loyalty, never sparing themselves and thinking only of one another. Heedless of danger, they took charge of the sick, attending to their every need and ministering to them in Christ, and with them departed this life serenely happy. For they were infected by others with the disease, drawing on themselves the sickness of their neighbors and cheerfully accepting their pains. Many, in nursing and curing others, transferred their death to themselves and died in their stead. The best of our brothers lost their lives in this manner. A number of presbyters, deacons, and laymen, winning high commendation, so that death in this form, the result of great piety and strong faith, seems in every way the equal of martyrdom. What were the results of the different beliefs and actions of the Christians? The Christians survived the plague in greater numbers than the pagans. Now, given that there was no known treatment for the disease, what possible difference could it make that the Christians stayed rather than fleeing like the pagans? McNeill pointed out, when all normal services break down, quite elementary nursing will greatly reduce mortality. Simple provision of food and water, for instance, will allow persons who are temporarily too weak to cope for themselves to recover instead of perishing miserably. Modern medical experts believe that conscientious nursing without any medications could cut the mortality rate by 2/3 or even more. So, after the plague, the ratio of Christians to pagans shifted substantially in the Christians' favor, simply because of the higher survival rate of Christians due to this nursing. Also, as I'll explain later, pagans were more likely to become Christians after the plague. So that was the plague of Galen, it's so-called 165 to 180. In 251, a new and equally devastating epidemic again swept the empire, hitting the rural area as hard as the cities. This time it may have been measles. First in the plague of 165, and again in the plague of 251, the balance shifted toward the Christians. They all died, but some died less than others, because of their beliefs and their actions. Okay, so why am I talking about what at the time was an obscure marginal cult? In 165, there were not a great number of Christians relative to the percent of the empire, though they were growing, as we'll discuss. I have come up with like 7 reasons. I kept coming up with more reasons as I prepared this talk. First of all, they won, and they did it in record time. The Christians went from very small numbers, perhaps a few thousand people in the mid-1st century, to, at the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, the Christians were allowed to follow their faith without oppression. And the reason why that's so significant is when you understand the history right, you understand that this edict was basically a reluctant admission by the Roman Empire that they had failed to destroy Christianity and had to somehow get along with it. It was containment time, right? We estimate that by about 350 AD, half the Roman Empire was Christian. Because it happened, it's hard to forget it happened for a moment and realize how remarkable it is that something that was very small in the mid-1st century had taken over the empire 200 years later. Just 200 years. Second, they did not have state backing. In fact, they had violent state opposition. Third, if it is legitimate to learn from Lenin about communist vanguards, and I think it is, why not learn from the Vanguard of Christendom? After all, this is our story, the origin story for Christian Europe. Fourth, in fact, it may be that there are limits to what we can learn from a Leninist vanguard, which after all succeeded ultimately only in destruction. They were a vanguard of destruction. We are, or hope to be, a vanguard of revitalization. The Christians faced, as we shall see, a degenerate empire, and they pulled something constructive out of it, our civilization. This is something to think about when we feel discouraged. Is there any hope? Can it be done? I like proof by existence whenever I can find it. The Vanguard of Christendom did it. 5, in my view, we are in a religious conflict. Deniers, for example, are the new heretics who will not offer a pinch of incense to Antonius Blair or Antonius Fauci. Right? And 6, this movement achieved what it achieved in those first few hundred years without using violence. Okay, so how did they do it? Pause for my backstory. I have some relevant personal experience to bring throughout this discussion of the early church. I grew up in what could plausibly be called a successful dissident movement. My father came to St. Louis in 1970 when I was a baby as a missionary to the Jews. He had been trained by Moishe Rosen, who would go on several years later to found Jews for Jesus in San Francisco. Being a missionary to the Jews is a little more common now, but back then it was rather unusual. I don't know if anyone remembers the Airplane movie, but there's a point where he's going through the airport and people are trying to pass him literature. Moonies, Hare Krishna, you know. One of them is Jews for Jesus, and he's kicking. Anyway, most people considered this an impossible mission. People said that to my dad. You're not going to get anywhere with that, right? But the Spirit was on the move in the 1970s, and many Jews indeed became believers in Jesus, along with many more Gentiles, through first a youth ministry and then a church, then several more churches spun off from the initial church. And by the way, I think this perhaps explains my relative sunny optimism to many of my friends. I know we face what feels like an impossible mission, but I've already been involved in one impossible mission, so a second one doesn't seem quite so intimidating. Our movement was notable for punching above our weight in terms of producing missionaries and leaders that are now working throughout the broader evangelical world. This happened because this movement was highly activist, with the new believer usually out on the streets witnessing shortly after their conversion so that they would learn that activism was the normal thing to do, as my dad would say, before they knew any better. This is just what we do, right? I think that's worth thinking about for ourselves, a practice we should adopt. In fact, I see it kind of happening. Those who join us should see a group of active people who expect them to, in turn, contribute somehow. So, with that background, back to our question, using the subtitle of the book I'm drawing from, how did the obscure, marginal Jesus movement become the dominant religious force in the Western world in a few centuries? Okay, now this is going to be very brief. I would love to go on more because of my personal interest, but first, you need to understand that Christianity traveled through a pre-existing social network in the empire, the network of Jews. They were already all over the cities of the empire, right? I'm leaving out a lot of this. I mean, because of my background, you can imagine this is part of the book. I was like, this is so interesting, but it's just not relevant to what I want to do today. I'm leaving out a lot, including Stark's compelling argument that Jewish believers remained a significant element of the early church well beyond what most have assumed, perhaps as late as the 5th century. But, as some of us around here think about sometimes, imagine the power of the Jewish International Network as the cult of Jesus spread through it from city to city throughout the empire and beyond. As an example, I have a little personal connection here. The Apostle Thomas traveled to a center of Jewish commerce in India named Cochin. It's in the modern state of Kerala. And to this day, 1/3 of that small state of India are so-called Thomas Christians. I have some very good friends from Cochin. All right, so how does conversion happen? Who in a society gets converted to a controversial new belief system? We need to understand this to understand how this movement grew, even to fully understand the implications of the plagues. Stark writes that modern social science relegates, and be ready, intellectuals, this is going to hurt, modern social science relegates doctrinal appeal to a very secondary role, claiming that most people do not really become very attached to the doctrines of their new faith until after their conversion. Rodney Stark and his partner John Laughlin were the first social scientists to actually go out and watch people convert to a new religious movement. Starting in the early 1960s, they carefully watched the progress of the first American members of the Unification Church, which we called the Moonies, right? So they actually were there from the beginning of the Moonies in America, to be clear. It started in Korea. But when it came to America, these social scientists were watching it from the beginning. The first thing we discovered, reports Stark, was that all of the current members were united by close ties of friendship predating their contact with the Korean missionary that had come over. The only ones who joined were those whose interpersonal attachments to members overbalanced their attachments to non-members. In effect, conversion is not about seeking or embracing an ideology, it is about bringing one's religious behavior into alignment with that of one's friends and family members. Okay? Attachment lies at the heart of conversion, and therefore, conversion tends to proceed along social networks formed by interpersonal attachments through friends, relatives, things like that, right? A great illustration of this is that when Mormon missionaries make cold calls, knock on the doors of strangers, this eventually leads to a conversion once out of 1,000 calls. So that's what, 0.01? Something like that. However, when missionaries make their first contact with a person in the home of a Mormon friend or relative of that person, get ready, this results in conversion 50% of the time. So above all, we should give weight to the presence and influence of friends. The basis for successful conversionist movements is growth through social networks, through a structure of direct and intimate interpersonal attachments. Most new religious movements fail because they quickly become closed or semi-closed networks. That is, they fail to keep forming and sustaining attachments to outsiders and thereby lose the capacity to grow. Close off the network, right? Successful movements discover techniques for remaining open networks, able to reach out into new adjacent social networks. So all these efforts by Hope Not Hate, SPLC, ADL are attempts to close our network, right? Make sure that we are only talking among ourselves and therefore cannot grow. Now, Academic Agent has said that there is no point in red-pilling the normies. But if we must remain an open network, don't we have to do that? Don't we have to keep on appealing to the normies, right? No. Now, I'm going to shock everyone here, but early Christianity was not a populist movement. Early Christianity was based in the middle and upper classes. Robert M. Grant denied that early Christianity was a proletarian mass movement and argued that it was a relatively small cluster of more or less intense groups, largely middle class in origin. W.M. Ramsey wrote in his classic study that Christianity spread first among the educated more rapidly than among the uneducated. Nowhere had it a stronger hold than in the household and at the court of the emperors. Can't get more elite than that, right? Now, I don't know of the dissident right having a strong hold in the court of the emperor, whatever that would look like today. But due to being friends with a number of content creators, they quietly tell me, we have friends in surprising places, and They just have to keep quiet about it. How could Christianity have grown so successfully in those first few centuries without making an appeal to the masses? Okay, so to understand this, we have to learn a critical distinction between a sect and a cult. I'll talk about our own movement to help us learn these concepts. A sect is a schism within a conventional religious body when persons desiring a more otherworldly version of the faith break away to restore the religion to a higher level of tension within its environment. I note the many efforts on the dissident right to sharply distinguish from liberalism by, for example, saying, we are illiberal. Pretty straightforward. This is an attempt to establish that we are not a sect of the current political religion, that we are something entirely different. This means we are claiming, in the language of sociology of religion, we are claiming to be a cult. So what is a cult? Cult movements are not simply new organizations of an old faith, they are new faiths. Cult movements always start small. As new faiths, cult movements violate prevailing religious norms and are often the target of considerable hostility, if you can imagine such a thing. So the dissident right is attempting to be a cult, not a sect. What does this have to do with a movement being proletarian versus elites? Sects draw from the proletarians. Cults draw from the elites. So the dissident right has been positioning itself, correctly mind you, as a cult of elites. So why are cults made up of elites? New religions must always make their way in the market openings left them by weaknesses in the conventional religions of a society. Some people will recognize and respond to these weaknesses sooner than others. For example, as the rise of modern science caused difficulties for some traditional Christian teachings, this was recognized sooner by more educated people. In similar fashion, as the rise of Greek and Roman science and philosophy caused difficulties for pagan teachings, this too was first noticed by the educated. To state this as a proposition, religious skepticism is most prevalent among the more privileged. I find it interesting to think back several years and note that some who are now in our sphere identified themselves literally as skeptics, right? Can it really be true that it is the privileged who are most likely to embrace new religious movements? This is precisely what we ought to expect when we realize that conversion to a new religion involves being interested in new culture, indeed in being capable of mastering new culture. Studies of early adopters of cultural innovations have long found them to be well above average in terms of income and education. New religions always involve new ideas. Consider citizens of the Roman world as they first confronted the Pauline Church. This was not simply a call to intensify their commitment to a familiar faith, as sect movements always are. Instead of calling Romans to return to the traditional gods, Paul called them to embrace a new worldview, a new conception of reality, indeed to accept a new God. While sects are able to appeal to people of little intellectual capacity by drumming the old familiar culture, new religions find such people difficult to reach. Thus, they must gain their hearings from people of social standing and privilege. So, we could, just for fun, be sociologically precise about what we mean by the term normie. The normie is someone who is not likely, indeed hardly capable of grasping radically new ideas and therefore being an early adopter of new culture. Now, why would elites, it needs to be elites, right? But why would elites bother joining a new religion? Well, they usually don't. There's usually stability, right? There has to be substantial discontent with conventional faith. Okay, now, quick, important bit of nuance here. People must have a degree of privilege to have the sophistication needed to understand new religions and to recognize a need for them. But that is not to say that the most privileged will be most prone to embrace the new religious movements, right? So we're talking about drawing from the privileged sphere, but maybe not the ones at the top, right? Only that the converts will be from the more rather than the less privileged classes. Indeed, Wayne Meeks proposes relative deprivation as a major source of recruits to the early church. People having substantial privilege, but less than they felt they deserved, were especially likely to convert, okay? Now, I won't go through it in detail, but Stark surveys data on modern cults and finds that they are consistently not proletarian movements. Mormonism, Christian Science, New Age, Scientology, Wiccan, they went and they studied them. They're from the middle and upper classes. Now, I bet you didn't expect to come and hear Radlib drawing a parallel between the dissonant right and Wiccan, but that's an extra bonus. Okay. So with these concepts and observations in place, let's examine early Christianity. During his ministry, Jesus seems to have been the leader of a sect movement within Judaism. On the morning of the third day, something happened that turned the Christian sect into a cult movement. Beginning with the resurrection, Christians were participants in a new religion, one that added far too much culture to Judaism to be any longer an internal sect movement. Of course, the complete break between church and synagogue took centuries, but it seems clear that Jewish authorities in Jerusalem quickly labeled Christians as heretics. They're cultists, right? Beyond the boundaries of the community, in the same way that Moonies are today excluded from Christian associations. More importantly for our story, Christianity was not a sect movement within conventional paganism. The early church was a cult movement in the context of the empire, just as the Mormons were a cult movement in the context of 19th century America. So our assumption is that early Christianity followed the pattern that we see in modern cults. Cult movements over-recruit persons of more privileged backgrounds. Now, all this is not meant to appeal to your vanity and being part of a privileged elite. We don't want pride, right? It is meant to help us be self-conscious of how such movements work so we can focus our limited time and energy. As AA has been saying, there is indeed no point in a focus on red-pilling the normies. Instead, we grow by working our way through a network of attachments among the relatively privileged. If we're successful in that, the normies follow down the road, right? Okay. Now, having introduced the importance of attachments in the growth of a movement, we're in a position to return to the plague story and reveal a little bit more about it. One of the things that made the long-term impact of the plagues worse for the Romans is that they were not reproducing, and they had not been for some time. Now, this really surprised me. In 59 BC, Julius Caesar secured legislation that awarded land to fathers of 3 or more children, though he failed to act on Cicero's suggestion that celibacy just be outright outlawed. 30 years later, and again in the year 9, the Emperor Augustus promulgated laws giving political preference to men who fathered 3 or more children and imposing political and financial sanctions upon childless couples, upon unmarried women over the age of 20, and upon unmarried men over the age of 25. Pretty based, right? But anyway, these policies were continued by most emperors who followed Augustus, and many additional programs were instituted to promote fertility. Trajan, for example, provided substantial child subsidies. Nothing worked. As Tacitus tells us, childlessness prevailed. As a result, the population of the Roman Empire began to decline noticeably during the last years of the Republic, and serious population shortages had developed by the 2nd century before the onset of the first great plague of the Galen plague. By the start of the Christian era, Greco-Roman fertility had fallen below replacement levels. Sound familiar? Leading to centuries of natural decrease. As a result, the devastating effects of the major plagues were never remedied. The plague would be over and they didn't replace the population with babies. For even in good times, the population was not replacing itself. By the 3rd century, there is solid evidence of a decline in both the number and the size of Roman towns in the West, even in Britain. So what did the empire do? It continued by importing barbarian settlers. As early as the 2nd century, Marcus Aurelius had to draft slaves and gladiators and hire Germans and Scythians in order to fill the ranks of the army. And I'm going to read this line only once, but listen carefully. What Rome had achieved was political unity at the expense of cultural chaos. Meanwhile, in keeping with the biblical injunction to be fruitful and multiply, Christians maintained a substantial rate of natural increase. Their fertility rates were considerably higher than those of pagans, and their mortality rates were considerably lower. Telling you the story of the plague illustrates a little bit of why that would be, but there's more reasons than that. Okay, why did the pagans have such low fertility? First, high rates of abortion and infanticide. This resulted in particular in pagan men outnumbering women. Men didn't like to get married. For the sake of Carl and AA, I had to include this line. One theme that recurs in Latin literature is that wives are difficult and therefore men do not care much for marriage. And then finally, use of birth control. I don't think Carl's here, but he gave me a little bit of flair for this part, thanks to Carl. Silphium was used widely in the ancient world as a medicine and aphrodisiac, but also in higher portions for birth control and even abortion. They could never cultivate it. They could never get it to grow in Italy, right? And so could only get it from a relatively small area as a native plant in Cyrene in North Africa. It went extinct from over-harvesting, to give the idea of what the scene was there. Pliny reported that the last known stalk of silphium is like celery, looked like celery, found in Cyrenaica was given to Emperor Nero as a curiosity. As far as we know, it's gone. Okay, among Christians, this imbalance in the sexes, the pagans had more men than women. Among Christians, the imbalance was reversed. Women outnumbered men in the first 5 centuries of the church, within the church. One major reason is that the pagans disproportionately killed their girl babies. So pagans had sex ratios like we see in China as a result of the one-child policy. We can actually see what happens when people decide just to have a few children and prefer boys, right? Christian women would often marry pagan men, resulting in secondary conversions of the men. They're like, okay, I'll be a Christian now, right? I thought this worth highlighting because it seems to me, so far as I can tell, we have the opposite situation. Based men vastly outnumber based women. So just like Christian women back then would often marry pagan men and convert them, or at least produce Christian children, our men may need to marry and convert normie women rather than waiting for a large number of magical pixie trad girls to appear. So little word to the wise. Okay, after a plague would hit, the ratio of Christians to pagans would increase due to better nursing, as previously described. The pagans, furthermore, would not replenish their numbers through reproduction, while the Christians would more than replenish their numbers. But there is a last part to the plague story. Because conversion, as we said, is related to how many of your attachments are in a cult versus not in it, the plagues resulted not only in relatively more Christians surviving, but also in the surviving pagans becoming more likely to convert after the plague. When you look at the effects of better Christian survival on which attachments survive, the effect is dramatic. In other words, now we're going to shift our focus from the individual survival to the dyads, right? Christian, 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 pagan, pagan, pagan. Attachments among pagans, pagan, pagan, were almost twice as likely to perish as attachment among Christians, Christian, Christian. Pagan bonds to Christians, pagan, Christian, were also much more likely to survive than those uniting pagans to one another. And it's even more dramatic than that back-of-the-envelope calculation would suggest, because pagans didn't just die, they also fled the epidemic, right? Pagan survivors faced greatly increased odds of conversion because of their increased attachment to Christians after the crisis was over. There was another way that Christianity was a better solution to problems faced by the Romans. The cities. Christianity was an urban movement. The Christian proportion of the population was substantially higher in cities than in the rural areas at this time, hence the term, as most of you know, paganus, or countrymen, came to refer to non-Christians, pagans, right? What were the cities of the Roman Empire like? The cities were marked by extraordinary levels of urban disorder, social dislocation, filth, disease, misery, fear, and cultural chaos. Just to give you a quick taste of this, the cities were small and tightly packed. Antioch was 2 miles by 1 mile, had about 150,000 people at the end of the first century. That comes out to 117 per acre. By comparison, in Chicago today there are 21 inhabitants per acre. Even Manhattan has only 1 inhabitants per acre, and they go up, right, in Manhattan, the vertical space. Buildings in Greco-Roman cities frequently collapsed. They overbuilt. But it gets worse because not all that area I just mentioned was actually occupied by people. A good chunk of it was occupied by public buildings, monuments, and temples. Usually about 1/3, in some cities, nearly half of the city acreage was unavailable for residential occupation. All this population density resulted in horrible sanitation problems, These cities were filthy, and therefore disease was common. The Greco-Roman city was a pest hole of infectious disease because it was always thus in cities. Indeed, it was not until the 20th century that urban mortality was sufficiently reduced that the cities of Western Europe and North America could sustain their populations without additional in-migration from rural areas. With all these new people flowing in, Greco-Roman cities were peopled by strangers. A lot of new people coming in all the time, right? It's well known that the crime rates of modern cities are highly correlated with rates of population turnover. Crime and delinquency are higher to the extent that neighborhoods or cities are filled with newcomers. This is because where there are large numbers of newcomers, people will be deficient in interpersonal attachments. And it is attachments that bind us to the moral order, right? So this is why, as we've noticed, large numbers of young men suddenly showing up from another culture, you're always going to have trouble. It's like a law, right? Ethnic diversity and a constant influx of newcomers will tend to undercut social integration. This is a major reason why Greco-Roman cities were so prone to riots. They were, to a great degree, ethnic riots. So, to cities, having sketched that, to cities filled with the homeless and impoverished, Christians offered charity as well as hope. To cities filled with newcomers and strangers, Christianity offered an immediate basis for attachments. You could join the cult, right? To cities filled with orphans and widows, Christianity provided a new and expanded sense of families. To cities torn by violent ethnic strife, Christianity offered a new basis for social solidarity. And to cities faced with epidemics, fires, and earthquakes, Christianity offered effective nursing services, as in the plagues. Once Christianity did appear, its superior capacity for meeting these chronic problems soon became evident and played a major role in its ultimate triumph. A personal comment on cities, by the way. I was reading the U.S. paleoconservative magazine Chronicles decades ago, before Paul Gottfried edited it, and being rubbed wrong by one thing. They hated cities. A conservative, it seemed, could only properly be conservative in like a distant village. And I have never accepted this. Cities are ancient. They are a place where this story happened, you know, the origin story of our civilization, where our civilization was built. And so I do not accept abandoning the cities. And even though I live on a farm, I'm actually still near the city. Nor do I accept that we will abandon all the other good and useful and built by us institutions that have been temporarily captured. With God's help, we will reclaim and rejuvenate all of our patrimony, everything. Now, how did the Christian movement do all this? Through an exclusive faith that had a high cost, which eliminated free riders. This allowed them to have effective collective action. Because counterintuitively, the more expensive the religion, the better bargain it is. Sacrifice and stigma were the dynamos behind the rise of Christianity, the factors that created strong organizations filled with highly committed members ready to do what needed to be done. Because religion is a collectively produced commodity. You can think of religious activities that require group participation, group worship, and so forth, right? But it's not just that, it's deeper than that. Religious faith itself is a social product, collectively produced and maintained. And the primary technique is testimonials, traditionally. Testimonials are the primary technique by which religious groups act collectively to generate faith. Believers recount experiences of personal regeneration that followed conversion or renewal, victory over alcoholism, drug dependency, or marital infidelity. In this way, people offer evidence that a religion works and that its promises must therefore be true. Now, I can testify about the power of testimonies because that movement I was a part of. We had so many people becoming believers regularly, it was quite common for someone to give their testimony. Like every week at one point, that was part of it, that somebody would give a testimony. I remember those testimonies made a huge impression on me. I'd remember them more than my father's sermons, which he wouldn't be upset because he knew how powerful testimonies were. To this day, the spiritual practice that I respond to the most is listening to the testimonies of others. I'm still not bored of my wife, for example, telling her dramatic testimony, which includes her being given words and visions just before and after her conversion that she only later found out were straight from the Bible. She's literally listening to a sermon and going, oh, that's where those words are from. And she'd already heard them, the Lord had given them to her. Testimonials are also more persuasive when the testifiers have relatively little to gain, or better yet, much to lose from having their claims heard and believed. And here's the key point. Martyrs are the most credible exponents of the value of a religion, and this is especially true if there is a voluntary aspect to their martyrdom. By voluntarily accepting torture and death rather than defecting, a person sets the highest imaginable value upon a religion and communicates that value to others. Christian martyrs typically had the opportunity to display their steadfastness to large numbers of other Christians, and the value of Christianity they thereby communicated often deeply impressed pagan observers as well. Alexander Adams was talking about this, and I was talking about this with him, about commitment, being fully committed, right? Can't get much more fully committed to saying, I'm going to go down in flames, I will not stop. No matter what you throw at me, I will not stop. I'm fully committed. People see that. The point of all this is that, counterintuitively, the more expensive, the better the bargain. You actually want to increase the cost of being in your movement to get the most benefit out of collective action. Two ways to do this, as mentioned, are sacrifice and stigma. Religious stigmas would be like prohibiting some activity deemed normal in external society. A good example from early Christianity was the requirement of Christian sexual morality, which was in stark contrast to the sexual practices of the pagans, which frankly were disgusting. Sacrifices consist of investments, material and human, and foregone opportunities required of those who would gain and retain membership in the group. Why do these help? They create a barrier to group entry, and they increase participation among those who do join. For example, if we may not attend dances or movies, play cards, go to taverns, or join fraternal organizations, as my dad taught me about the Baptists, don't drink, don't dance, don't chew, don't go with girls that do. We will eagerly await the Friday church social, right? So you're giving up some things, but you're investing more heavily in your cult, right? The consequences of all this are, by demanding higher levels of stigma and sacrifice, religious groups induce higher average levels of member commitment and participation. And religious groups then, now with the power of collective action, right, miraculously, they're able to generate more benefits for their members. Greater material benefits, social benefits, religious benefits. As each member pays the cost of membership, each gains from higher levels of production of collective goods. For a religious group, as with any organization, commitment is energy. That is, when commitment levels are high, groups can undertake all manners of collective actions. Small groups, right? So how did this look like for the early Christians? Sacrifices included a number of do-nots, as already mentioned, like restricted sexual practices, but also there were many things Christians were expected to do. Care for the sick, the infirm, and the dependent, for example. We take care of our own, right? And as discussed, Christians were sometimes called on to make the ultimate sacrifice. Note that the benefits of martyrdom were not exclusively experienced in the afterlife. People who knew that they were going to Rome for trial and they expected that they would be executed by the emperor or whatever, right? They would do like this triumphal tour on the way, with local Christians at each stop coming to meet them and hear sermons. I don't know why the Romans allowed this. They were stupid. But anyway, the local Christian at each stop, Christians would come, and it became very clear that to all the Christians that extraordinary fame and honor attached to martyrdom. And you experience it in this life, right? I've been watching with interest to see that being canceled is increasingly celebrated. Now, consequences of simply stupid behavior like Fed posting aside, I've noticed that my friends are more likely to boast than be ashamed that they got kicked off Twitter or even lost a job. So, because the church asked much of its members, it was thereby possessed of the resources to give much. Tertullian noted that members willingly gave to the church, which, unlike the pagan temples, did not spend the donations on gluttony. And quoting Tertullian here, For the funds are not taken thence and spent on feasts and drinking bouts and eating houses, but to support and bury poor people, to supply the wants of boys and girls destitute of means and parents, and of old persons confined to the house, such too as have suffered shipwreck. And if there happens to be any in the mines, or banished to the islands, or shut up in the prisons for nothing but their fidelity to the cause of God's church, they become nurslings of their confession. The results became more and more apparent. Christians had longer life expectancies than pagans. They've actually gone back and they've studied graves and, whatever records we have from those days. Christians actually were living longer. They had better support. Now, had to include this section for my friend AA. How did the early Christians organize? First, one must understand that Greco-Roman paganism was non-exclusive. Think of the relationship of pagan religions to their adherents as being like practitioners and clients. A client may be at the temple of Zeus one day and Venus the next. And there was nothing wrong, no one thought that was bad, no more than visiting a fortune teller one day and a palm reader the next. Okay, that's the atmosphere. McMullen says, at the very towering peak of their appalling rage and cruelty against Christians, pagans never sought to make converts to any cult, only away from atheism, as they saw it. Toleration gone mad, one may say. By the way, that term atheism, from the Roman point of view, only accepting one God while rejecting hundreds was close enough to believing in no gods at all. That's why they would use the term atheist, right? For this reason, I've often been tempted over the years to write an article called Proud to be an Atheist, because I reject the gods of this age. So in that old Roman sense, I'm an atheist relative to the reigning religion, right? Here is the downside of this liberal, tolerant approach to religion by the pagans. Pagan cults were not able to get people to do much of anything. At the bottom of this weakness is the inability of non-exclusive faiths to generate belonging. Christianity, on the other hand, was exclusive. History suggests that when non-exclusive faiths are challenged by exclusive competitors in a relatively unregulated market, the exclusive firm wins. If you're an exclusive religion, though, that comes with some requirements. You have to offer full service. Otherwise people go down to the religion, down the pagan temple down the road to meet their needs, right? And your exclusivity is broken. So the church provided social security, belonging, a comprehensive belief system, and spiritual and social activities appropriate for all ages. One-stop shop or department store, right? The fundamental strength of an exclusive faith is its strength as a group. Central to this sense of community and belonging, one common to all exclusive religious groups, were the strong bonds between the clergy and the rank and file. Clergy were not distant elite within the cult. They were teachers and they were friends. Tertullian explained that clergy was selected not by purchase, which would happen in the pagan temples and later in the Anglican Church, I think. Anyway, not by purchase, but by established character. I experienced this in our movement. Our movement had a principle of selecting leaders from those who already had an established track record. Some denominations will send people off to, young men, untried young men, off to get a theological education to seminary or something, and then pick one of them and make them a leader. We would not do that. We would have someone within the movement who we were watching, and we were seeing that they were stepping up, they were proving their character. And their commitment. They were basically already doing the job, and we just formally recognized what had become obvious, right? So you wait till someone has proved themselves before you give them a position of leadership. The funding of the early church is also particularly interesting to me. They relied on small voluntary donations. This meant they were not dependent on state support. The pagan temples, by the way, definitely were. They were state subsidized. Nor did they rely heavily on wealthy donations. There was a lot of small donations from the people within the cult. Now, I don't think there's much chance of us being offered the temptation of state funds, but I do feel concerned sometimes that a wealthy patron could come along and compromise the movement, right? Lou Rockwell at the Mises Institute, if he were here, would tell you, just say no. Say no to billionaires. You will not want to pay the price for all that free money. So Christianity grew because it constituted an intense community. All right, so here's my wrap-up. How'd I do on time? Good? Okay. Perhaps one of the various power fantasies of the right will come true, and we will clear them out next year with a Thanos snap. But I think it is more likely that we are just at the beginning of a long but not endless road. The history of the early Christians suggests that we can win by doing these things. Taking care of each other through persecution and crises. This has turned my own attention, along with some friends in America, you may be hearing more about that soon, to setting up mutual aid arrangements of some sort, which used to be typical in our societies, by the way, as late as the 19th century. It's only been about 100 years that the mutual aid societies have been gone. I think we can get them back. Keeping our focus on extending through existing networks of privileged people, having high costs of being in the movement to eliminate free riders and set a standard of activism, having better solutions to social problems, taking advantage of crises by building attachments to people who are losing attachments. Maybe we can even save some of these I left the left, or the left left me people, you know. And I don't think, by the way, I don't think we need to be worried about a supply of crises. Our bio-Leninist regime seems to excel at providing them, so let's not worry about that. I don't think accelerationism is required. We just sit back and watch them stumble, you know. And you knew I would have to say it by having babies, right? The regime will cycle through waves of persecuting us, then tolerating us, then throwing us a bone, then back to persecuting us again. That entire cycle is a distraction. AA's been bringing this up. They're going to throw us a bone, everyone's going to be gone. Can't let that happen. My hope is that our focus will instead be on supporting each other and eventually, when we grow, doing something about such horrors as mass ethnic rape here in the UK, for example. Real solutions to serious social problems that are not being addressed by the reigning orthodoxy. I think they can't address some of these things. They literally don't have the resources to do it. Theological, so to speak, resources. There's an opportunity in this, as in so many other problems, because I don't think the current elite, I said that, could address some of these problems, even if they wanted to, and we can. I believe Tertullian gave us the guidance we need. He said of early Christians that, remember, took over the Roman world in very quick time, really, historically speaking. It is our care of the helpless, our practice of loving kindness, that brands us in the eyes of many of our opponents. Only look, they say, look how they love one another. Do we have any time, sirs?
15 minutes.
Okay, quick bit of Q&A. Leave the phone. Hey.
Thank you. That was an excellent speech.
Thank you.
Just a question. So how do you reconcile the collective nature of Christianity with the individualistic nature of capitalism and consumerism?
Well, I think it's really tricky, and I'm not going to be able to give you a full answer. I think it's really tricky because, of course, I didn't get into it in this talk, right? But the things I was describing about early Christianity, you might notice, may not remind you very much of your local congregation, right? So Christianity has changed over time. I mean, it was a cult and a dissident movement, and then it became normal, right? So obviously it changed its character, right? So I would have to dig into it, but I kind of wonder if we dig into the earliest of capitalism, which I've argued on my channel, you have as early as what I call the Industrial Revolution of the Middle Ages, which was going on 1,000 years ago. If you look back at how things worked then, it might look a bit different than what we think of as capitalism now. we get too abstract sometimes, right? Oh, this is all capitalism, this is all the market. Well, the market probably looked a little bit different in 901,000 than it does in 2022, right? So anyway, I would want to look at early capitalism and think about that.
Thank you very much. Fantastic talk, I thought. I was really interested in some of this sociology around cults and sects.
Yeah.
Because it struck me as you were talking, it was like, well, you know, the Christians, they were literally trying to take the, the Roman, were taking over the Roman Empire. They'd been there for a long time.
Yeah.
Well, when we look at the current ideology, I mean, in that taxonomy, I mean, how are they just a kind of a sect of liberalism? Are they a new cult? I'm talking about the wokesters now. I'm talking about the ruling ideology. And if they are a cult, is there any model for like cult on cult action? I guess, So.
Well, I don't know. I mean, this is one of the things that I've found really confusing, and I don't know if you've parsed this any better, AA, but people talk about sort of like, when did things go wrong, Was it with the Reformation, Was it with John Stuart Mill liberalism, Everybody's got a different answer. Talk to any right-winger, they'll give you a different point in history where Charles I, I was just talking to a guy who said when they beheaded Charles I, basically everything that happened since then has been inevitable. Everybody's got their pet theory. So I don't exactly know what to call what we're up against or what its time horizon is, right? Is it something that's been around for the 20th century, like progressivism? I tend to kind of think about progressivism a lot, which isn't that old, 150 years old, right? Or as, Imperium Press would have it, it's liberalism writ large, which who knows how far back that goes, Or Christianity, right? It's just Christianity is the problem, right? So now you've got 1,500-year time span. So it is not clear to me how old the thing we're fighting is. I don't see, or let me put it another way, I don't see consensus on that. But from our point of view, I would say it is the established religion. And relative to it, we are the cult, and as I already mentioned, we can tell because of their reaction. They treat us like a hostile entrant, right?
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. I thought that was a very inspiring speech, and also thank you for mentioning me. In terms of martyrs, the obvious thing is that you see people sent to prison. We have hate speech laws that will send maybe some of us to prison for relatively innocuous things that are deemed outside of the norm. We don't have the death penalty here, but could you see them trying to sort of excuse perhaps a political assassination or something if any person on the dissident right or a dissenter became too prominent? Could you see them sort of giving a wink to an extremist action?
Right. Okay. Well, two things I want to say. First of all, you should try America. Move against the Clintons and see how long it takes before you commit suicide. If we use the term "our regime" broadly to include, the West, Anglo-American, then I think, I don't want to be too conspiratorial, but I think they take people out, and sometimes I think it's quite clear, right? Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, come on. But I would say this. We think of martyrs as people who were killed for their faith. That's not technically correct. A martyr is someone who bears witness for their faith against opposition. So from my point of view, it is not hyperbolic to say that someone who loses their job or goes to jail because of their devotion to dissident right things. And does it, how do you put it, in a responsible way, right? In a committed way, not in a stupid, Curtis Yarvin's 12-year-old child way, right? But in a committed, responsible way, they refuse to back down, they state the truth, and they really, truly suffer for it. They know that they're going to suffer for it, and they wouldn't have to suffer for it if they would back down, but they don't back down, that in my mind is a martyr, if there's real consequences. You don't have to be killed to be a martyr, but it inspires everyone around you, right? Because your commitment, you showed real commitment.
Thank you. It was a great speech. I'm interested in the hypothesis in the fact that Christianity was a utilitarian adoption by the Roman elite because they needed a universal religion for a universal empire and to combat the Persians, which had a universal religion in Zoroastrianism. So what do you think of that as an alternative hypothesis to, rather than a capture by the Christians, it's a, it's like a utilitarian adoption, much like the Protestant Reformation in Northern Europe.
So what time period do you have in mind?
Constantine's adoption, he is...
In 300?
Yeah,
okay. Yeah, that story is not going to fly because I was almost going to try to do a visual and decided to stay away from technology for this talk. But I could show you the estimate, the graph, the growth curve, okay? And how did it go from these small numbers to like half the Roman Empire or whatever by 350. And the key thing is that growth curve is just consistent from every piece of data we can get. There isn't a flip. It just, as the social network grows, the surface of the social network, if you can picture it that way, the contacts, the surface of the social network becomes bigger. People within the cult have more and more contacts as the cult grows, right? And so it's just continuing to grow, and that's how you get this exponential growth. We'll think of the surface of a sphere getting bigger, right? And it's just consistent. There isn't a point there that we could go, oh, there's a big jump when the Romans decided for Machiavellian reasons to become Christian. And like I said, I think it's just so obvious for so many reasons that this was the Roman Empire just throwing its hands up and going.
So you think Constantine legitimately believed in Christianity when he could basically make...
No, I was arguing not the Machiavellian way in your sense, but I would say it seems likely. And remember the Constantine Edict of Toleration, which was with a co-emperor, had already been put forward a couple years before. This wasn't new policy just because of Constantine's personal conversion. To me, it's better to see it as a political move by the Roman ruling elite going, we don't have moral unity anymore because half the empire, it's getting there. A lot of the key empire, of the privileged, even a higher percentage, right, are on board with this Christian thing. If we don't make a move here, we're going to be too out of alignment with where our people have gone, right?
Yeah, thank you for that. Just a quick observation and then a question. The observation being as somebody who's very recently joined this movement, at the moment you go into it, you're sort of faced with that choice. Do I use my own name? Do I use my face? And you're very aware that as soon as you do, you instantly lose the ability to be employed by about 60% of the opportunities in the country. You can't be appointed to certain boards and other operations. So I like that you made that a virtue. The question was actually a bit of a challenge around your cities thing. You talked about cities as being valuable, as something we need to claim back. And I understand that the logic was basically there because they have the population density that allows for network formation to occur more easily. I just wanted to provide the challenge that actually I think cities are lost to us and we don't need to care about them because we can get those same mechanisms through the online space. It gives us that density and the ability to build networks.
Yeah, no, I hope it's clear to everyone that this talk was meant to start a conversation that we need to have on a number of issues, and cities is one of them. I just have not found the conversation around cities very serious, right? I would like to have a longer view on it like I gave here, a recognition that cities have been crucial to our civilization, and not just go, it's based to be out in the country. I just would like a deeper conversation. So anyway, yeah, so you're saying we don't need the cities because we can just use our online thing. Yeah, but with the emphasis on basket weaving and everything, right? We know that it's important to meet face to face, and then you're back to population density, right? So to a degree, as we know from this room, the online thing is a way that helps us, but I don't think that's everything. I think we have to have these in-person meetings, and then you're back to who's close to me, right? And London gets 20 people. If I get up to 5 with my Missouri meetup, I'll be thrilled.
Brilliant speech.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Just to sort of carry on with that as well, as a Londoner who is moving up away from the city.
Yeah.
I hate London.
Yeah.
But I have met many, many brilliant people through basket weaving in the London area. And it has been the most successful weaving community in the country, and I think globally so far, I think that's fair to say. Much as I am very reluctant to admit it, I think we probably do need to reconsider the city question just on the basis of your argument there about it. So
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Let me make a comment on that and then go back to something else. So one of our pastors, it was the hippie days, right, the 70s and everything, and he wanted to do like a back to nature thing. He became a Christian, like that was sort of in motion or in planning or something, and then he became a Christian through our ministry. And then he went off to some cabin in the middle of nowhere in Canada with like a Bible, you know. I'm a new Christian, but I'm going to be in the woods with 2 buddies and get away from civilization, right? And he was there for, I don't know how long, a year or 2 or something like that, reading his Bible and stuff. And finally, I don't know if it was reading his Bible or just the Lord gave it to him, but he felt convicted that he needed to go back. So if for some people you need a little time off, that's fine, but be open to the call that maybe you need to go where you're needed, you know. And then one other comment following up on the face identity reveal. I meant to say this. I've had 2 people who either have asked me for advice in the movement or I have given advice in regards to revealing their name and face, and I advise them to do it. You know, they have to weigh the costs, count the costs, but I advise them to do it. And really it comes back to the thing that Alexander and I were talking about, this commitment thing, right? And it may be cliche to quote from Blade Runner, but it is words I live by. He says, to live in fear, that's what it is to be a slave.